Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong, still trying to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. This is the traveling edition, the on-the-road edition of the History of Being Human podcast. So it might sound a little different. I'm actually recording from the shores in beautiful Anacortes, Washington, at the Heartful Retreats, in a place I could only describe as the tiny temple of podcasting. And despite being surrounded by beauty and comfort and luxury, we're still the only podcast that dares to dig into the soft pink underbelly of the Inquisition, to inquire into the Inquisition. Today we're going to talk about the Inquisition's most famous victim. And since you've already seen the title of the episode, I know you know who I'm talking about. That's right, I would say the most famous victim in all the history of this sordid office was Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc's story is nothing short of amazing. I'm saying that with no irony whatsoever. You often hear that people are a product of their times, and of course that's true for Joan of Arc also. But in this case, the converse is also true. That is that Joan's times were a product of her. And that's an extremely rare thing to be able to say about somebody. But she was a fearless juggernaut, breaking sieges, taking fortresses, turning the tides of battles, changing the terms under which the entire 100 Years' War was fought. She single-handedly shifted the paradigm. And in so doing, she became probably not just the most famous woman of the late Middle Ages, but the most famous human of the late Middle Ages. She is far more famous than the king that she helped enthrone, far more famous than the barons and nobles that she defeated and drove out of France, and of course more so than the people who put her to death under the Inquisition also. So while most people today couldn't tell you anything about the life and times of Charles VII without a little prompting, many of them could tell you something about Joan of Arc. And not only was she the most famous, the most renowned and reviled woman of the late Middle Ages, she's also one of the best documented. We know more about Joan's life than almost any other woman, especially common woman, in history. Unfortunately, that's because she underwent two trials. One trial which condemned her to death, and then a second trial which absolved her, cleared her of any guilt whatsoever. A fact which, unfortunately, Joan was not around to gloat over because she'd already been burned alive in a hideous, torturous death. Which is why some people, and yes, I'm talking to you, Inquisitors, some people might find it a good idea to offer a condemned their appeal before burning them alive at the stake. That's just something you might want to think about. Anyway, that's why we have so much information about her, because of these very detailed trial records. They dug into her past, trying to find something to condemn her of, and later trying to find a reason to absolve her. What makes Joan's story so remarkable? Well, one of the things that makes it so remarkable is that she was not nobility. She was a peasant girl. And I call her a girl not to be dismissive, but because her life didn't even last 20 years. So she was a peasant girl in a time and place where being a peasant made you almost unworthy of mention or consideration, and where being a girl was almost a refutation. Her society was stratified in a way that few of us can even comprehend today. And yet to be given an audience with the crown prince, to lead and inspire men in battle, to single-handedly turn the tides of the greatest conflict of her age. If the story of Joan of Arc wasn't so well documented, frankly, I'd have a hard time believing it could even happen. That's how astonishing it is. Small wonder then that Joan is one of the most celebrated, but also one of the most appropriated women and symbols in history. You could almost say she's all things to all people. To Catholics, she's a saint. She's a pious believer in the sacraments and institutions of the church. But to the secular, she's a victim of that church, a victim of religious intolerance and bigotry, put to death in a kangaroo court by the very institution that later canonized her as a saint. Conservatives politically see her as a war heroine, militant nationalism in defense of God and country. Feminists see her as a breaker of barriers and stereotypes, a strong woman who refused to accept the restrictions of custom or bow before the entrenched patriarchy. And the truth is that none of these views of Joan are entirely wrong. They may be too narrow in their focus, but Joan really was all of these things. According to the historian Stephen Ritchie, quote, "The people who came after her, Joan, in the 5 centuries since her death, tried to make everything of her. Demonic fanatic, spiritual mystic, naive and tragically ill-used tool of the powerful, creator and icon of modern popular nationalism, adored heroine, saint. She insisted, even when threatened with torture and faced with death by fire, that she was guided by voices from God. Voices or no voices, her achievements leave anyone who knows her story shaking his head in amazed wonder." End quote. Well, today I'm also going to appropriate Joan of Arc. In particular, for this series on the Inquisition, Joan was one of the victims of that institution. Without a doubt, like I said, its most famous victim. Her trial before the Inquisition is well documented, and it's a case study in much that was wrong with the Inquisition itself, how it could be used by powerful interests to condemn their enemies, how the courts could be set up to deliver a predetermined verdict, and how a little chicanery could ensure the desired outcome. So today and for the next 3 episodes of the History of Being Human, we'll talk about the background, the life, and then the trials of one extraordinary human being, the Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc. To understand Joan's influence and what happened to her, you have to put her in her time and place. I guess that's true for anybody. Joan might have been extraordinary in any age or any time, but the particular milieu in which she achieved her greatness was the 100 Years' War. Now, let's just admit right now, the 100 Years' War is a topic so dense and muddled, especially to a 21st century American mind like mine, that it could be the subject of several podcast episodes, several seasons of podcast episodes, and it would be all too easy to get lost in the details. But the big picture is pretty easy to understand and actually can be pretty entertaining. So today we'll look at a big picture overview of the 100 Years' War. Next time, we'll talk about Joan's biography, and then finally, we'll go to the trials of Joan of Arc. Probably the first thing that you need to understand about the 100 Years' War is that it wasn't 100 years long. The name should not fool you. That's a perennial trick question on quizzes and trivia games. The 100 Years' War lasts 116 years, from 1337 to 1453. It was not one never-ending, prolonged, protracted battle. There were gaps in the conflict, gaps sometimes of years or even decades, but the war itself did indeed drag on for that long. I mean, think about it. People were born, grew up, lived to a ripe old age, bore children. They saw their grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow up and grow old, all under the shadow of this conflict, never knowing the next time their crops were going to be burned or their village pillaged or their taxes raised to pay for the struggle. And the truth is, most of the common people had no dog in this fight whatsoever. This was a battle of kings and nobility over inscrutable points of inheritance law in many cases. And yet the common people were subjected to all the violence, deprivation, and miseries galore as rich and powerful interests duked it out. And the cause of all this misery and woe, the one-sentence answer for what was the 100 Years' War about, it was a battle to the death between the Plantagenet family of England and the Valois family of France over who was the rightful heir to the French throne. That's it. Thinking, French thrones go to the French family, English thrones to the English family. There shouldn't be any controversy at all about this. But to understand why it was a source of violent disagreement, we have to go back in time. And since I have to start somewhere, I'm going to start in the late 700s. The year 793, to be more specific. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, a record written at that time, records that this year, 793, did not get off to an auspicious start. According to the Chronicle, quote, "In this year, 793, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook. There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky." So you can tell that's already a pretty bad year. You've got lightning, which many years probably had, we have to admit, but you also have fiery dragons flying in the sky, which he mentions casually, almost offhandedly, as if that's a pretty common occurrence, pretty common omen. But along with that, you have excessive whirlwinds. So I guess there's a number of whirlwinds that are just pretty accepted, pretty ordinary. But this year, those whirlwinds were excessive. And as bad as all that was, things were about to get much worse. The chronicler goes on, quote, "These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne." End quote. So most historians peg that date when the Vikings landed at Lindisfarne to the 8th of June, 793. And the reason I bring that up is that's when most historians peg the beginning of the Viking Age, when these strange, terrifying ships land on Lindisfarne and perpetrate acts of unspeakable violence on the monks living there. According to Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar who lived in Charlemagne's court at the time, quote, "Never before had such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets." End quote. These Vikings must have seemed worse than the fiends of hell. Not only did they seem to take delight in murdering, they had no respect whatsoever for these sacred places and sacred relics on Lindisfarne Island. So that date, when the Vikings landed on Lindisfarne, which most historians peg to the 8th of June, 793, was the beginning of what came to be known as the Viking Age. The age when men from the north, which they called Danes or Norsemen, which we would now call Scandinavians, boarded their longships and did what they called go Viking, which meant to plunder, pillage, raid, and steal along the coastlines of continental Europe and Great Britain. So that's the Viking Age. Now, the Vikings didn't always have a hit-and-run policy. They didn't always come to a place, burn it down, and then leave. The Vikings were also farmers and fishermen. They wanted to raise families and live in peace just like every other human being. So if they found a particularly choice piece of land, looked like something they could defend, sometimes they would just call their friends, move in, settle down. Other times they would negotiate a peace with some of the inhabitants or rulers in the area. And at times that meant taking a Christian name, getting baptized, joining the PTA, well, not quite that far, but living like respectable folk in the land. So let's move forward through the Viking Age to the early 900s. We're still at the height of the Viking Age. Go from Lindisfarne in England down to the northern shores of France, about 110 years later. There's a certain number of Norsemen who have secured a permanent foothold in that rich, fertile valley of the lower Seine River. And one of these Norsemen is a man named Rollo, a man whose very name means ruler. Rollo emerges as the greatest warrior among all those Norsemen in northern France. Vikings admire courage and might, and Rollo is a very bold man. So bold, in fact, that he could be accused of hubris. In the year 911, he smashes his way down through the lands of northern France, pushes his plundering a little bit too far, and gets himself hung up and pinned down in the city of Chartres. Chartres, you may know as the city where the beautiful Gothic cathedral is located, south and west of Paris. So the armies of Charles the Simple, the king of all West Francia, trap Rollo in a siege at the town of Chartres in the year 911. And of course, Rollo did not prepare for a lengthy siege. He doesn't have supplies of food and water, so he has no choice but to surrender to the king of West Francia, Charles the Simple. Now, despite his name, Charles the Simple is a pretty wise man. He makes a good call. Rollo has proven himself to be a strong leader, and Charles needed somebody to help rule his northern lands, put a stop to all the Viking marauders who trouble the peace of his realm. And who better to fight off Vikings than another Viking? So Charles makes Rollo an offer that he quite literally really can't refuse, and it was actually quite a generous offer, all things considered. Charles tells Rollo that he would let him live, and in fact grant him all of the lands between the mouth of the Seine and what is now Rouen, in exchange for Rollo agreeing to end his Viking ways, stop his brigandage, swear allegiance to King Charles the Simple, become a Christian, get baptized, and, what seems kind of weird to us now, agree to marry King Charles' then 5-year-old daughter Gisela as his one-day wife. Rollo agrees to the deal, so it was apparently done and made official because there's a charter from the year 918 in which Rollo is listed as the official leader of this region, and the region is called, quote, the Duchy of Normandy, end quote. So Rollo has gone from being a Viking raider to a French duke ruling over French lands at the pleasure of the French king, to whom Rollo was a subject. So Rollo and his followers, through their intermingling with the indigenous population, settle the land and become known as the Normans. What does this have to do with the 100 Years' War? Well, don't worry, I'm going to get to it one of these days. Move down to the year 1066, so another 130, 40 years later. William, the Duke of Normandy, is a descendant of Rollo, so he also is a subject to the French king. Well, William becomes William the Conqueror when he wins the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and actually eventually conquers all of England, becoming the King of England. So even though he is the King of England, under the terms of his ancestor Rollo's initial agreement, William was sworn to the King of France. So you see already how messy this is starting to look. The King of England was technically a vassal to the King of France, making England just another French territory. Now that was a pretty stable, mutually beneficial situation until the kings of England became almost as wealthy and powerful as the king of France. Then there was bound to be friction, which I guess is a nice way to say that occasionally this would burst out into open conflict, as was the case with Henry II. Henry II was one of the wealthiest and most powerful early kings of Norman England. In fact, his wealth and holdings rivaled those of the King of France. He was the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, so he's already Duke of Normandy and King of England. From his father's side, he inherited the province of Anjou to the south and west of Normandy. So Henry II already has vast holdings. Now enter into this picture Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor is probably the second most famous woman of the High Middle Ages, after Joan of Arc herself. Eleanor is the Duchess of a region in southwestern France called Aquitaine. And if you're thinking that doesn't sound very French, you're right. The region was named by the Romans Aquitania because of all the aqua. It's a very rich region. In fact, Eleanor was married to King Louis VII of France for several years. But unfortunately, they had a horrible relationship, which did not result in any male heirs, and that's what they were seeking. So after 2 daughters were born, the relationship is terrible, and the marriage between Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis VII of France is annulled. Now, the last thing that Louis VII wanted was for his already unruly vassal, Henry II, to get even more rich and powerful. So the last thing he would want would be for Henry II, King of England, to marry the Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor. But that's exactly what happens. As soon as her marriage with Louis VII is annulled, she becomes engaged to King Henry II of England. And contrary to expectations, Henry II never asks for Louis VII's permission to marry Eleanor of Aquitaine. And with this marriage, Henry II becomes far richer. In fact, just to give you an idea, the royal profits from the region of Aquitaine rivaled all of the royal profits from Henry II's holdings in England and Normandy put together. So with one marriage, Henry II almost doubles his holdings. So having incurred the royal displeasure of Louis VII, Henry II and Louis fight what's termed a Cold War for the next several decades. Henry continues to apply pressure to the French king and to expand his own territory into Brittany, into Toulouse. Despite numerous peace conferences and agreements, which Henry II breaks, he continues to expand his empire. So Henry II is a very wealthy and powerful king whose wealth and power rival that of the King of France. Henry is considered the first Plantagenet, the first member of the House Plantagenet. Where does that name come from? It's hard to say for sure, but it's thought to be that in the province of Anjou, there's a plant called the common broom with a yellow flower. That plant is called the plante geneste. And not wanting to be called the common broom family, they're called the Plantagenet family. A line which stretches all the way from Henry II, that very powerful king, to Richard III. So Henry II is in this Cold War with the King of France. But unfortunately, Henry II is almost a Davidic figure, almost like King David. His own sons rebel against him on a couple of different occasions. And his own sons are almost as famous or more famous than he is. They include Richard the Lionheart, King John of Robin Hood fame, and another Henry named Young Henry. Anyway, there's various intrigues in the family. The sons rise in rebellion. Henry II puts down that rebellion with a great expense of blood and treasure, and instead of punishing his sons, he forgives them frankly. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who joined with Richard's side of the rebellion, he doesn't forgive quite as readily. He imprisons Eleanor of Aquitaine until the day of his death. And Eleanor, who outlives Henry II by several years, is only freed when her son Richard Lionheart ascends to the throne. But that's neither here nor there for today's episode. The point for the 100 Years' War is that Henry II pushed his holdings into some of the territory belonging to Louis VII. Richard Lionheart was fairly successful at maintaining those holdings, but his brother King John, again he of Robin Hood fame, was not so successful. By this time the French king was Philip II, and his attitude was, the English king is still my vassal, and I declare not only their new holdings in Brittany and Toulouse forfeit, but all of their Normandy holdings are now forfeit, and Philip II reclaimed those territories. He conquered Normandy, taking it from King John of England. So now the French king is holding Normandy, and the English kings still feel entitled to those ancestral lands. So the son of King John is named Henry III. He decides he's going to go back in, kick some butt, and take back Normandy from the King of France. Unfortunately, he fails. He lands in Brittany, marches around with his army in the year 1230, achieves nothing, and goes back to England with his tail tucked firmly between his legs. Not content, he makes another effort in the year 1242. Once again, he tries to reclaim his lands in France, and unfortunately, he is totally routed and forced to run home again to England. So you can see that the English king felt that he had some moral authority, at least, to go try to reclaim the lands in Normandy. But after losing twice to the French, he's forced to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1259. The Treaty of Paris essentially allows the English king to maintain his holdings in Aquitaine, that very rich region, but all of the lands in Normandy and northern France are forfeit. And even though there's a treaty in place, the English kings aren't very well satisfied with it, and there are several skirmishes between France and England over the next several years. So this is the way things stand just before the 100 Years' War. There is a simmering tension between the English and French thrones. Just to review what got us here, Vikings land in northern France and settle there. They become officially vassals of the French king and dukes of Normandy. These dukes of Normandy conquer England and become the kings of England while still the dukes of Normandy. They then expand their territory and holdings in France, much to the displeasure of the French king. The French king reclaims most of those lands and all of their Normandy holdings. And this, of course, doesn't sit well with the English kings. This brings us to the year 1328, when an unstable situation became chaotic. Charles IV of France died in 1328, and he was childless. So who is going to become the new French king? Well, the King of England at the time, Edward III, was the nephew of the French king. Edward III's mother was a woman named Isabella. She was the sister of Charles IV, the French king who had just died. So this is just a big mess. The English king was the nephew of the now dead French king, and that gave him, in his own mind, a claim to the French throne. Unfortunately, the only people objecting to this were all of the nobility of France. The French barons had a meeting. They said, no, we need a French king, a French native, to be the new French king. And so in 1328, they chose the French king's cousin, Philip of Valois, to be the new king, Philip VI. And Philip VI was crowned. Edward initially objected, but he was only 15 years old at the time. He didn't put up much resistance. And after the French nobility promised to allow Edward to keep the province of Aquitaine, he submitted to their decision and supported King Philip VI of France. Now, when you hear that the 100 Years' War was fought between the House of Valois and the House of Plantagenet, this is the reason why. Philip of Valois was the first Valois crowned King of France, and Edward III was a Plantagenet. Their initial relationship was actually fairly cordial. They even planned to go on a crusade together, and the image of the King of France and the King of England riding to the Holy Land and slaughtering the infidel warmed the hearts of all England and France. That crusade was supposed to take place in the year 1332, but unfortunately it was never executed. They became bitter enemies within 4 more years. By 1336, they were sworn enemies. What happened between 1332, when they were going to go on crusade together, and 1336, when they were bitter enemies, is that the King of France was a little too chummy with the King of Scotland. The King of Scotland, of course, is the sworn enemy of the King of England. So in other words, Philip VI of France cozied up to David, King of Scotland, and this infuriated Edward III of England, with the French king harboring the sworn enemy of the English king. And possibly in retaliation, Edward III harbored one of the sworn enemies of the King of France. So the King of France is harboring an enemy of the King of England. The King of England is harboring an enemy of the King of France. This is just the level of discourse at the time. In response to this feud, Philip VI of France declares that Edward III of England has now forfeit the entire province of Aquitaine. Aquitaine, as I said previously, was a very rich holding, and in Edward's mind, Philip had just gone way too far. He was not going to give up Aquitaine, and in response, he did something entirely new. Edward said, Philip VI of the House of Valois is not the rightful king of France. I, Edward of the House of Plantagenet, am the rightful king of France. That's why historians divide the time period of conflict before the 100 Years' War from the 100 Years' War proper. This is the first time that an English king had claimed the French throne for himself. So in 1337, the 100 Years' War was on in earnest. Now, initially, France fared very well. They were kind of at the height of their medieval power, whereas England had been weakened by some of the factors we talked about earlier. And initially, Edward III was going into terrible debt trying to prosecute this war. But Edward III was actually a pretty shrewd diplomat. He was able to talk some of the discontented French nobles into joining the English side. So Montfort, Brittany, Navarre all joined with Edward against Philip VI. And this had the effect of making it almost impossible to contain and control all of the outbreaks of violence from Paris alone. And it almost made it impossible for the French to actually invade England. They were too busy fighting on French soil. Along with this, then the English kings from time to time would launch chevauchées, these large-scale military raids deep into the heart of French territory. Their object was not so much to capture and hold French territory as to plunder, burn crops and buildings, damage the economy, and undermine French morale. And as such, they were extremely effective. In fact, in what's called the Great Chevauchée of 1346, Edward III succeeded in capturing the port city of Calais. Now, between 1347 and 1353, there were not a lot of battles fought between humans. That's what I call the puking flea apocalypse. The Black Death was ravaging Europe. And when a third to a half of your population is dying, when entire provinces are being abandoned, when villages are being turned into ghost town by a deadly pandemic, you're not marching your armies out into that mess. And if you've forgotten how devastating and catastrophic the Black Death was, you can go back to the episodes I recorded in early 2019 as part of my Adapt or Die series about the Black Death, Rumblings in the East, and Plague Life. A little bit of shameless self-promotion there. But after the Black Death left France, Edward, the Black Prince, came with several raids. Edward, who is called the Black Prince, was actually Edward, the son of Edward III, and at the time was Prince of Wales. His great chevauchée of 1356 culminated in the Battle of Poitiers, where Edward the Black Prince captured the King of France, John II, and the Crown Prince of France, Philip. So between 1356 and about 1360, chaos reigned in France. Not only had the Black Plague just devastated the countryside, now it was kingless. Charles of Navarre went into revolt against the French crown and claimed Paris temporarily in the year 1358. There was also a major peasant uprising, what's called the Jacquerie, in the central provinces. And along with that, there were freebooting companies of soldiers. Soldiers who no longer had a clear chain of command, who were rampaging their own way, plundering and pillaging around the countryside. So with France in such terrible shape, it's no surprise that Edward III decided to push his claim to the French throne at just that time. In 1359, he led his last great chevauchée toward the city of Reims, the place where French kings were traditionally coronated. Most historians can't decide if Edward was serious about taking the French throne or if he just wanted to be in a very strong negotiating position. Because when he failed to enter the city of Reims or Paris, instead of engaging in some kind of lengthy conflict, he entered into negotiations with the Crown Prince Charles of France. And the upshot of those negotiations was Edward III said, "I will no longer claim to be the King of France, but I want an enlarged Aquitaine and I want all autonomy, all control over Aquitaine. And along with that, I need 3 million crowns to release King John back to France." And for a while at least there was peace. Edward stopped calling himself King of France, and there were no more sorties running into French territory. The tide of the war turned somewhat in France's favor after 1375. That's because Edward III was a very old man. Edward the Black Prince, a very capable military leader, was also extremely sick. So the English side was weakening, whereas the French side, under the new King Charles V, a very shrewd leader, was strengthening. Whereas before, his predecessors had always tried to go out and stop the English raiding parties, to fight them, to engage them on French soil. Charles V had a different policy. When the English sent a raiding party into France, he sent his ships to the south of England to plunder, pillage, and burn villages on the English coast. Seems like kind of an obvious, and it was a very effective strategy. They also succeeded in recapturing large portions of Aquitaine from the English. So between 1375 and 1380, the French military had a revival of sorts. In 1380, Charles V died, though, and that French military revival was kind of running short of steam. In fact, both sides were getting pretty war-weary. And between 1380 and 1399, as the war had been dragging on for 50 and then 60 years, the war seems to have lost some of its luster, some of its magic for these monarchs. They actually considered negotiating a final truce. But unfortunately for the people of France and England, right around 1399, conditions would deteriorate badly in both kingdoms. Mad kings in both kingdoms would lead to a significant prolongation of hostilities. The English king, Richard II, was proving himself to be either a full-fledged narcissist or possibly schizophrenic. He had been deteriorating for years, and finally around 1399 he was decompensating. He arrested and killed several of his most important lords and began to persecute anyone who was loyal to those lords throughout the countryside. And as Richard II was childless, he had no son, he began to fear others who might make a claim to the throne either before or after his death. In fact, the heir apparent, Henry Bolingbroke, he exiled to France for life. Finally, Parliament relieved him of his kingly duties in 1399 and appointed Henry IV. And if royal conditions were suboptimal in England, they were far, far worse in France, because there the infamous King Charles VI, formerly known as Charles the Beloved, was well on his way to becoming known as Charles the Mad. You can't be too hard on Charles VI, because it's clear he was schizophrenic. His first episode occurred in 1392. It was during an expedition that he had organized to punish a rebellious duke in Brittany. People who were there said that Charles appeared to be in a fever and began the campaign with a disconnected, rambling speech. So he sets off with his army on the 1st of July, 1392, and the army travels very slowly, as armies are wont to do. But Charles VI loses it. He can't stand how slowly the army is traveling. So he's already getting very impatient. Then, to make matters much worse, as they enter a forest on one hot August morning, a person described as a barefoot leper runs up to the king's horse and grabs its bridle, and in a frenzied voice shouts, "Ride no further, noble king! Turn back! You are betrayed!" The king's escort beats the man back, but they don't arrest him. They just say, "Get out of here, you crazy man." But the man follows the procession of the king for half an hour, yelling threats and warnings to the king. So the king's company of horsemen actually make their way out of the forest, and just then, one of the pages drops a lance. He's tired, he falls asleep, and he drops a lance. The lance clangs off the helmet of another soldier, and the noise startles Charles VI into action. Charles VI, among a company of his own men, draws his sword and says, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy." He spurs his horse and begins charging and attacking his companions. And this goes on until his chamberlain and a group of soldiers can stop him, drag him from his horse, and put him on the ground. And according to the accounts, his eyes glazed over, and he lay there as if he were dead. But before they were able to subdue him, he killed a knight named the Bastard of Polignac, several of his other men, and badly injured many others. Unfortunately, things didn't get better after that. Sometimes he ran wildly through the corridors of his residence. They actually had to board up the walls of his Parisian residence to keep him inside. In 1405, he refused to bathe or change his clothes for 5 months. According to the Contemporary Chronicle, this is Pope Pius II who wrote this. He was born during the reign of Charles VI, but he wrote in his commentaries that there were times when Charles thought that he was made of glass, and he tried to protect himself in various ways so he wouldn't break if people were to touch him or come into contact with him. And one of the ways he'd do this is to sew iron rods into his clothes so that they would protect him. It's really just a very sad story of schizophrenia. But with the king so ill, it's natural that a lot of intrigue sprung up in the court around him. The de facto ruler of the kingdom at the time was his wife Isabeau, who presided over a regency council. And two of the most important members of this regency council were the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans. The Duke of Orleans was a man named Louis I, and he was not only a member of Queen Isabeau's presiding council, he was suspected of being her lover also. So as his power and influence grew, there were a lot of rumors as to why, and the Burgundians, the Duke of Burgundy and his followers, became increasingly irritated by his power. And this irritation and these intrigues were about to turn deadly. When Philip of Burgundy died, his son John the Fearless was dispossessed, kicked off of the Queen's Advisory Council, and Louis I of Orleans broke up the Burgundian lands. John the Fearless was incensed. He decided to take matters into his own hands. And on November 23, 1407, while Louis I, the Duke of Orleans, was visiting Queen Isabeau, he collected a group of 15 men that ambushed Louis and stabbed him to death. So the Burgundians had stabbed to death the Duke of Orleans. This effectively pushed France into a state of civil war, with the two most powerful families in the kingdom duking it out. Hey, I wonder if that's where that term comes from, duking it out. On one side you have the House of Burgundy, the Burgundians. And on the other side you have the House of Orleans, known as the Armagnacs. And with them, the French monarchy was aligned, because remember, Louis I was the lover of Isabeau, who was the wife of Charles VI, who couldn't rule from time to time during his bouts of madness. Well, there was a new king in England at the time, the very bold, courageous, and intelligent Henry V. Henry loved to make war almost as much as Edward III, and as the feud dragged on between the House of Orleans, the Armagnacs, and the Burgundians, Henry V saw an opportunity. He launched his own chevauchée into France in 1415, which culminated in the Battle of Agincourt, which was disastrous for the French crown. In that battle, some 5,000 or 6,000 English archers and a few cavalry defeated an overwhelming French force, consisting of all of the allies of the Duke of Orleans. And at the end, some 5,000 or 6,000 Frenchmen were dead compared to about 600 Englishmen. The Duke of Orleans himself was captured in the battle. This is still considered one of the greatest, most resounding, overwhelming victories in the history of the English monarchy. And you can't imagine how demoralizing this would have been for France. After this victory, Henry V returned to England, but then he came back to France again 2 years later in 1417, and he opened up an entirely new style of campaign. No longer would it be the plunder, pillage, and run back home to England. This time, he wanted to conquer, keep, and hold French lands, because he correctly predicted that the civil war between the Burgundians and Armagnacs would weaken the French army significantly. So Henry laid siege to town after town and conquered town after town across the French countryside. And by January 1419, the capital of Normandy, Rouen, had fallen to the English forces. And it was only then that the French warring factions realized what a dire strait they found themselves in. Yes, the Burgundians hated the Armagnacs and vice versa, but they all hated the British. None of them wanted to be subjects to Henry V. So finally, in late 1419, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, agreed to meet with the leader of the Orleans family in Montereau to coordinate a resistance to the English army. This was a very important agreement. The best hope for France was for these two warring factions to come together to fight the English. But on 19 September 1419, when the two parties met on the bridge of Montereau, John the Fearless was struck down by assassins from the Armagnac family. They had never forgotten that 12 years earlier, John the Fearless had killed Louis I, Duke of Orleans. And there on that bridge in 1419, they avenged Louis I. Well, at this point, France was hopelessly divided. The Burgundians, rather than ally with the father's assassins, the hated House of Orleans, the Burgundians, the family of John the Fearless, decided to ally with the English. This prolonged the 100 Years' War by decades, and it put Charles VI, the ailing Charles VI, in a position of hopeless weakness. At this point, he had no choice but to negotiate a peace agreement with Henry V. This became the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. The terms of the Treaty of Troyes were repulsive to most Frenchmen, because it pretty much amounted to a total surrender and capitulation to the English demands. During the Treaty of Troyes, they agreed that Henry V would marry the daughter of Charles VI named Catherine. Henry V would become regent for Charles VI, even while Charles VI was still alive. And then in the end, when Charles VI died, Henry V would be the heir, the king of France and England. So in 1420, Henry V had accomplished everything he had set out to do. Exploiting internal weaknesses in the French kingdom, he had brought more glory and wealth to the English throne than any of his predecessors. And he had done all this by the time he was 33 years old. And if he had lived, there's little doubt that he would have become the king of France and England. But Henry V would be dead within 2 years, by the time he was 35 years old. Charles VI, King of France, even in his weakened condition, survived Henry V by 2 months. So this is the situation. Around the time that Joan of Arc comes on the scene, the King of England, Henry V, and the King of France, Charles VI, have both died. Charles VI of France had signed the Treaty of Troyes, promising the French throne to the English king. The Burgundians support this treaty and are so allied with the English to that extent. The mortal enemy of the Burgundians, the Armagnacs, the followers and allies of the Duke of Orleans, oppose this. They refuse to see an English king on the French throne, and instead they have thrown their support behind Charles, the son of Charles VI, Charles who's known as the Dauphin, the Dolphin. He is the heir apparent to the throne of France before the Treaty of Troyes. That's who the Armagnacs support as the next king of France. The French have been weakened by internal division, by a civil war. The English are in a very strong position. If you look at a map of France around the time of Joan of Arc, you will see that the English and the Burgundian faction control all of the north of France, much of the east of France, and a large chunk of the southwest of France. That leaves the Armagnacs and the Crown Prince, the Dauphin, in charge of a much diminished central and southern France. And it's into that scene that Joan of Arc is born. So I meant to make this a very quick review of the 100 Years' War. I thought, well, if I can do the Bible in 50 minutes, I can do the 100 Years' War in 30. But next time we'll talk about Joan of Arc, her life, her accomplishments, right up until the time of her trial before the Inquisition. I have to say I'm recording on new software, so please forgive the glitches along the way. I will try to rectify those next time. It's taking a little while. There's a learning curve on this new software, but in the end, I think it's going to be superior. So this concludes the on-the-road edition, the traveling edition from the tiny temple of podcasting at the beautiful Heartful Retreats in Anacortes, Washington. Remember to write me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. That's thobhpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your kind comments. Thank you for your suggestions. And yes, your corrections also.